We've been talking in the course today about expectations, trying to give students realistic expectations of what they can anticipate in a classroom. And we've been looking at 4 countries, and we watched a video today on expectations in an American classroom. And so I'm going to ask you, based on not only your experience at Cambridge, but you have been in a broader UK context.
Mm-hmm.
Can you sort of set out the expectations, and what does the class environment look like in the UK?
Mm-hmm. Yes, there are usually really 2 kinds of teaching framework, 2 kinds of classrooms which international students will likely participate in during the course of their time in a British university. The first would be a lecture. So a lecture is where a historian, a physicist, a chemist, whoever it is, a teacher, is standing in front of the class, giving a survey, giving an introduction, giving establishing a framework for the discussion of a topic. So a lecture will likely include introducing students to the key bullet points around the topic which is being discussed, will likely include a range of different conceptual frameworks or different kinds of perspectives which might be used by people to think about the topics at hand. And essentially the idea of the lecture is to establish a framework in which discussion can be held. So it creates a base so that all students will have a certain knowledge, a certain level of confidence that they can then expand on in the second kind of classroom, which is the seminar room, or sometimes called the tutorial room, or the supervision room. And depending on the group size, these rooms are often smaller than the lecture hall. So you might find there might be several dozen people attending a lecture, but you'll be broken up into smaller groups to attend a tutorial or a seminar. And these tutorials are the framework for discussion of the lecture or of the topic as part of the course. And these really are probably the most important aspects of the British university system. This is where students get the opportunity to talk through their response to the lecture, to the content of the material, to any reading which they've been doing in preparation for the tutorial, and to, very importantly, to articulate their own perspective, to give their own feelings or ideas about a certain topic, to give their own response to the work which they've been doing. So the British model is really defined by a form of collaborative learning, which is to say the lecturers, the seminar leaders, and the students as a group are expected to come together and comment, to interrogate the topic at hand. And it's probably worth pointing out that lectures too, although they are not as interactive as seminars, do allow for students to participate. So I don't want to give the impression that lectures are intended to just be a more passive form of learning in which students just sit there while a lecturer decants the information which they have. All lecturers will allow students the opportunity within a lecture to ask questions, to clarify anything which is raised in the lecture. And then the response to those questions, the response to the ideas of the lecture are translated in more detail into the discussions of the tutorial or the seminar. So I think it's very important to think about lectures and seminars as interacting in a kind of synthesis. They have a certain amount of a slightly different cadence, which is to say in lectures, lecturers do have a more obvious leadership role to play in the session, whereas students have a certain amount of independence to shape the discussion, to change the conversation in the seminars. But they are bound together. They are a symbiotic relationship, I think.
So are lecturers typically the ones who run the seminars, or are they different people who run the seminars?
That can vary depending on the university and the year group. Sometimes the lecturers will be different to the seminar leaders. And that's usually the case in more junior classes. So in the British system, especially first and sometimes second year undergraduates will have different leaders in their different classrooms. So a more senior member of the teaching team will be the lecturer in lectures, and then often more junior members of staff, sometimes graduate students or teaching assistants,
Right.
will lead the conversation in seminars. Usually in final year courses and third or fourth year courses, where the subject matter is a little bit more detailed, where seminars and lectures are really delving into material at a level which requires a specialist knowledge, then often in those situations, the lecturer will also serve as seminar leader.
Right.
In the international system, for visiting students, you can expect perhaps different versions of that to play out in different contexts.
Right. So let's dig a little deeper in the discussion group, because you have pointed out that there seems to be an expectation of students participating. So which is different than the lecture. So the lecture is more setting the framework, trying to meet the goals of the course, and then it's a meaty discussion. That can be difficult, I would assume, for international students who aren't necessarily used to not only participating, but actually giving their opinion on something that's being given to them. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, I can. And I think the first thing to highlight is that the point of these seminars is to establish a conversation about the topic, and that they're not predicated, there's no assumption that there's a right answer or a wrong answer. The idea of the sessions is to allow students to demonstrate their knowledge, but also to ask questions, and in some cases to criticize or to push back against some of the ideas which perhaps have been expressed in a lecture, or which might come out during the course of the seminar. So the point of the seminar is not really to achieve agreement necessarily amongst all the participants. It's not necessarily to be right or wrong. It's to have a conversation, to probe ideas, and to hopefully to develop new insights and new and clarify knowledge on the issues which are raised. Now, international students can sometimes struggle with that because some universities outside of the British system do have a more rigid sense of that what they're looking for is for students to be right or wrong, and that there's a kind of level of assessment in place. That's not really true of seminars. Insofar as there is a level of assessment, the vital thing is to get involved, to make a contribution. And in a sense, it doesn't really matter what you say. It's just to get stuck into the conversation and see what comes out of that. In terms of alleviating any anxieties which students might have about participating in these sessions, the first thing I think it's worth highlighting is that none of these sessions will be isolated. They will always be based on a previous lecture and or some kind of pre-circulated reading. So it's very important for students to go to the lectures which have been allocated in relation to the course, and to do the reading, or as much of the reading as they can do, in relation to the individual topic for the seminar. And that means that when you come into the seminar, you will have a foundation of knowledge, and that's really all that you need to have. If you've done the work which you've been asked to do, then nobody is going to try to trick you, nobody is going to try to expose you as inadequate in any way, or try to highlight the things which you don't know. So the seminar space is always a very positive environment. It's about allowing you to build on the work which you have done. And there are different ways in which a seminar can play out. Sometimes a class might be divided into groups and asked to talk amongst themselves quietly and prepare some sort of a presentation or a response to a question which the seminar leader has set. Sometimes students will will sort of sit around a table, and there'll be an open conversation with everyone participating, which might be voluntary, which is to say the seminar leader might invite students to participate, to volunteer themselves, to make a contribution to the conversation. Sometimes it might be a little bit more authoritarian, which is to say students might be identified by name and asked to make a contribution. But again, the purpose of that is really to just get a range of different perspectives and different insights into the room. It's not about identifying people in order to expose them in any way. And I think sometimes international students, it takes a little time for them to adjust to that idea that they might be called on to speak, that there is no right answer to the question which has been posed, that really what they're being asked to do is to talk out loud about their immediate reaction to a particular point, or to think through out loud their understanding of a certain issue, which is to say they're not expected to come with a fully formed definitive perception. And I think that the best seminars, by the time as this process takes off and as more and more voices are heard and the group gets to know each other and becomes more familiar with each other, what you usually start to see happening is the group as a whole responds to each other. The individual members talk to each other, they pick up certain points. Always very politely, of course, that's very important. But polite criticism, polite discussion within the group is the idea, is the thing which the seminar is trying to achieve, that people can agree with each other, people can disagree with each other, and they can use the space to talk through their ideas and see what their peers, what their fellow students make of those ideas. And in a sense, in the best seminars, the seminar leader actually becomes less obvious, and the students themselves can take over in terms of shaping the conversation and how it plays out. And that's often a process for international students. It does take a while for that rhythm to establish itself. But I think so long as students come having done the work and recognizing that the purpose of the seminar is to engage positively with the material, then they can get an awful lot out of that. And often it becomes, I think, a very exciting, interesting experience for them.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure it is very exciting, but I think, as you said, it's probably a process that they will have to learn. I think that many of our students from China are in classrooms where they're given a lot of material and asked to give it back rather than asked to question it. And because you've mentioned the word question, and actually it takes me into our next topic, which is about critical thinking. Because what you're describing is critical thinking, and so can you maybe speak to your own, you help them understand what critical thinking is?
Yes. So perhaps if I speak as an historian, as an example, a lot of what I say in this case will be relevant to all kinds of other issues too. So most material which you might be presented in an academic course as a student in the UK system is contestable, which is to say there are likely to be different interpretations, different emphases on the topic from specialists in the field. So specialists, as we all know, disagree amongst themselves. There's really no such thing as experts, in the sense that nobody is entirely certain that they are right all the time. There's always debate, there's always new information, new knowledge, which is reshaping our perspectives on academic material. So in the case of history, we might take, as a case study, we might take, for instance, the Civil War in Britain, which broke out in the mid-17th century. So lots of historians have different interpretations of this event. Why was there a civil war in the mid-17th century? And some have said it's a political crisis. It's a crisis about the relationship of the king and the parliament. Some have said it's a crisis to do with religion, different kinds of Christians fighting each other to achieve primacy in the country. Some have suggested it's to do with social issues and class, so poor people fighting rich people, and so on. So all of these interpretations exist, and there is evidence supporting them. Um, so they're all equally valid in a sense, and yet they are not necessarily, they seem quite different to each other. They seem quite different. So how do we as readers of history, do we as students of this topic examine this issue? What is the right answer? And as I was suggesting in our previous conversation on the seminars, a lot of learning in the British university system, whether it's historical or another topic, is based on the idea that there is no right answer. But what there is consensus about is the approach which should be taken to this material. So this is often thought of as critical thinking about a subject. And I think when we're thinking about critical thinking and the kinds of skills which are deployed in relation to it, again, the important thing to emphasize is the fact that in the British system, for the most part, there is no right or wrong answer. What academics are interested in assessing, what professors are interested in looking at, is the process by which students arrive at their conclusions. And that process is shaped by an infrastructure, a structure of critical thinking. And really this is defined by an awareness and an openness to competing perspectives on a certain issue. And students are expected to be aware that there are different sides to an argument, and to actually go out and seek out other sides of an argument, not just to accept one or two perspectives. And of course, that means thinking for themselves about why something might be perceived to be the case. So in the case of the British Civil War, students might have their own ideas based on their reading as to why this conflict broke out. And that's not necessarily wrong, even if other historians haven't mentioned it before. We only get new ideas by challenging the consensus, and critical thinking is really about challenging the consensus and building on the consensus to create new frameworks for thinking. So the first point about critical thinking is to be looking for all sides of an argument. And I think the second point is then to test these arguments. So how do we do that? How do we figure out which arguments are sound, which are good arguments, which are bad arguments? And that's really about evidence. So it's looking at an argument, looking at a topic, and thinking about the kinds of evidence which are being put forward to support an argument. So in history, this might be documents, it might be manuscripts, it might be diaries. We might be looking at, what do the people who are fighting the Civil War in Britain in the mid-17th century say in their diaries? What does the Parliament say in the statutes which it is issuing at this time? And in all kinds of courses, that idea holds true. Evidence is required to support the arguments which are being made. But of course, evidence isn't enough, because sometimes evidence contradicts itself, or one piece of evidence is not necessarily obviously supporting another kind of evidence. So we need to not only investigate evidence and think about its soundness and the quality of the evidence, but also to really interrogate in detail the value of the evidence, the quality of the evidence, and to think about it in relation to other kinds of evidence, to try to pick up a more detailed picture. We need to think about where the evidence is coming from. So again, in a historical context, we might think about who is writing a diary. How old is this person? Is this person rich or poor? So the context which is creating the evidence is very important. And again, in the sciences, you might think about the kinds of experiments which are creating evidence. What are the problems maybe underlying some kinds of experimental work? Are there different ways of approaching the question which the experiment is designed to answer? So having a broad perspective on different approaches to answering a question which has been set is very important. So what you're looking to do is to think about an argument critically, to identify the evidence which is being used to support that argument, whether it's based on an experiment or based on material from the archives or based on economic data, whatever it might be, and then thinking about really in a detailed way about the quality of that evidence in relation to the argument. So does this evidence support the argument which it is being used to support? If an economist is saying A plus B equals C, well, is that equation true? Is it really working? Are there any problems in relation to A and B? So thinking critically involves really challenging, thinking in a detailed way about the mechanisms by which we generate evidence and the conclusions that we draw from that evidence.
Wow, that's that's very well described and very complex for students, I would assume, to think about, especially as undergraduates, and
Yes.
in context perhaps like China, where there hasn't been as much in terms of being challenged to think critically. So in your example of the Civil War, what you're saying is that students shouldn't make assumptions that what they're reading is the truth. It's somebody's truth.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. And I think even in the case of science, of scientific work, you know, experiments are always shaped by specific contexts, and it may not be clear to students what those contexts are, but the challenge is to think a little bit beyond beyond the solution which is presented to them, and to think in more detail about how that solution was arrived at. Are there better ways of doing this? Are there obvious problems with this? And I think it's also worth emphasizing that the point of critical thinking is not necessarily to provide an alternative.
Right.
A student doesn't to actually respond to any difficulties which are exposed. Part of the process is just exposing the difficulties, exposing the challenges. There isn't an expectation that students will actually come up with an alternative. They may do, and that will be great. But there's no expectation of that. But the point is, I suppose, to just have a little bit of cynicism and caution, perhaps, about the material which is presented to them, and to just think about where it comes from, why it exists, why has this knowledge been created.
And then I would assume that, you know, what you were saying is this, if students are reading different opinions of the same thing, then what they are challenged to do is come up with their own opinion, but not only come up with their own opinion, to back it up, right?
Absolutely.
Why
Absolutely.
do I feel this way? That is key to it as well.
Yes. And this has to be based on evidence and the use of, you know, of real evidence. It can't just be a sort of feeling or an emotional connection, or you know, a sense of sympathy with, say, certain historical actors. If we take a historical example, you can't just argue that King Charles I was a nice person because you feel that way.
Right.
You have to have evidence to highlight that. You have to have case studies.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely.
Right.
And that is challenging. It is challenging because, of course, when you're reading different works by different experts, by specialists in their fields that are perhaps arguing very effectively for very different interpretations of a certain topic, then it's very difficult to weigh up which is better, you know, which is true. But the point of the exercise perhaps isn't to conclusively decide. The point is to just interrogate and to work out what you think is more persuasive. But other people can disagree, and that's okay.
That's okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, in the seminar room, you will have conversations where some people will disagree with other people, but they can both be applying critical thinking skills. They can both be using good evidence, and neither is right and neither is wrong, and that's fine.